Anno 52 before Christ, the hills of Gaul. Julius Caesar stands on a wooden tower and scans the horizon. His eyes, trained by years of war, detect something that freezes his blood. A cloud of dust rises in the distance. It is not an ordinary cloud, and it is the kind of dust raised by hundreds of thousands of feet marching in unison. One of his officers runs up the tower stairs, breathless, with a face pale with terror. "General, the scouts have returned. It is the Gaul Relief Army. They are more than 250,000 men." Caesar does not reply immediately. He looks down at his own lines. 60,000 Roman legionaries, good soldiers, the best in the world. But they are only 60,000, and they are trapped between two massive enemy forces. Behind them, inside the fortress of Alesia, 80,000 Gaul warriors led by Vercingetorix wait for the perfect moment to attack. In front of them, a human ocean of 250,000 vengeance-thirsty warriors approaches like an unstoppable storm. 330,000 enemies, 60,000 Romans. Caesar finds himself at the center of what will soon be the deadliest trap in ancient history. But here is the incredible part. Caesar is not the prey. He is the hunter. Because what you are about to witness is something that defies all military logic. Something no general in history had attempted before, and very few would dare attempt after. Caesar will capture 500,000 men, not with chains, not with prisons, but with something far more brilliant and far more brutal, with walls, traps, and the most advanced military engineering the ancient world had ever seen. This is the story of the Battle of Alesia, the story of how 60,000 men surrounded, trapped, and crushed 330,000 warriors in the most audacious siege of all time. How did he do it? What kind of mad strategy could turn certain defeat into the most decisive victory in Roman history? If you are passionate about military history, impossible strategies, and battles that change the world forever, this is the right place for you. Like this video? Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell, because what you are about to discover is a masterclass in military genius, brutal engineering, and unyielding determination. We will dissect every detail of this operation, every trap, every wall, every decision that turned Julius Caesar into the most feared conqueror of his era. Get ready, because this is Alesia. To understand the greatness of what happened at Alesia, we must first go back in time and understand who the men were who faced each other on this battlefield and why this clash was inevitable. We are in the year 52 before Christ. The Roman Republic is at its peak, but also in its most turbulent moments. Rome controls much of the Mediterranean, but its expansion northward into the wild lands of Gaul has been bloody, brutal, and costly. And at the center of this conquest is a man who will change the course of history forever. Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar is not just a general. He is a shrewd politician, a brilliant orator, and an unrivaled military strategist. In the year 58 before Christ, he assumed the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul. But Caesar had much greater ambitions than simply administering a quiet province. He needed military glory. He needed wealth. And above all, he needed political power in Rome. Gaul offered him exactly that. For 7 years, Caesar waged a ruthless campaign of conquest, subduing tribe after tribe, massacring entire populations. According to his own writings, more than 1 million Gauls were killed and another million reduced to slavery. The Roman legions marched through forests, rivers, and mountains, bringing Roman civilization at sword point. But the Gauls were not defenseless barbarians. They were fierce, proud, and courageous warriors. And in the year 52 before Christ, they finally found the leader they needed to unite against the Roman invader. His name was Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix was young, charismatic, and brilliant, son of a chief of the Arverni tribe. He succeeded in something that seemed impossible, uniting the traditionally rival and fragmented Gaul tribes under a single banner. For the first time in generations, the Gauls were not fighting each other. They were fighting together against Rome. And Vercingetorix was not an impulsive leader. He was strategic, calculating. He knew he could not defeat the Roman legions in traditional pitched battles. The Romans were too disciplined, too organized. So Vercingetorix adopted a different strategy. Scorched earth. He ordered his people to burn their villages, destroy their crops, and retreat to fortresses. He deprived the Roman legions of supplies, forced them to march through empty territories, exhausted them physically and mentally. It was a war of attrition, and it was working. In the spring of 52, before Christ, Vercingetorix achieved something that seemed impossible. He inflicted a defeat on Caesar. In the city of Gergovia, the Roman legions were repelled with significant losses. It was Caesar's first great humiliation in Gaul, and for Vercingetorix, it was a signal that Rome could be beaten. But Caesar was too dangerous to be underestimated. After Gergovia, Vercingetorix made a decision that would change everything. He decided to regroup his forces in a natural fortress on top of a hill, surrounded by rivers and valleys, a place from where he could control the region and coordinate Gaul resistance. That place was Alesia. Alesia was not just any city. It was a natural, almost impregnable fortress located on top of Mont Ossois with steep slopes and two rivers protecting its flanks. Alesia was the perfect place to withstand a siege. Vercingetorix brought 80,000 warriors there, the flower of the Gaul army. From Alesia, he could wait for the right moment to counterattack. But when Caesar arrived at Alesia, he saw something different. He did not see an impregnable fortress. He saw a trap. If he could surround Alesia, if he could keep Vercingetorix trapped inside those walls, he could destroy the heart of Gaul resistance in one blow. But there was a problem, a huge problem. Vercingetorix alone had sent messengers to all the Gaul tribes asking for reinforcements. And those reinforcements were coming. A massive army gathered from every corner of Gaul. 250,000 warriors were marching toward Alesia to crush Caesar and his legions. So Caesar faced an impossible decision. He could retreat, abandon the siege, and admit defeat, or he could stay and risk everything in a bold gamble that no sane general would attempt. Caesar chose to stay, and what he did next was absolute madness. He ordered his legionaries to build not one but two complete rings of fortifications. The first facing Alesia to keep Vercingetorix trapped inside, the second facing outward to keep the relief army out. The Romans would become both besiegers and besieged at the same time. Now think about it for a moment. 60,000 men surrounded by 330,000 enemies, and instead of fleeing, instead of looking for a way out, Caesar decided to voluntarily lock himself in the middle of them. Was it genius or madness? You are about to find out. To fully understand why Alesia became the scene of the most decisive clash between Rome and Gaul, we must understand how we got to this point, because the war did not start at Alesia. It started years earlier with blood, fire, and a series of calculated mistakes on both sides. Vercingetorix did not appear out of nowhere. His rise to power was the direct result of years of Roman brutality in Gaul. Caesar had conquered tribe after tribe, but his method was ruthless. He was not simply seeking military victory. He sought total submission. Tribes that resisted were massacred. Those that surrendered were reduced to slavery. Gaul bled under the sandals of the Roman legions. But in the winter between 53 and 52, before Christ, something changed. The Gauls, tired of Roman oppression, began to conspire. Secret meetings multiplied. Tribal chiefs, traditionally enemies of each other, began to talk of unity, and in the midst of this cauldron of resentment and rage, Vercingetorix arose. His first act as leader was bold and brutal. He gathered the warriors of his tribe, the Arverni, and launched a surprise attack against the Roman garrisons in the depths of winter. The Romans did not expect an offensive at that time of year. The Gaul winter was cruel with deep snow and impassable roads, but that was exactly what Vercingetorix counted on. He attacked quickly, struck hard, and disappeared before Caesar could react. Caesar was furious. No one had challenged him like this in years. He gathered his scattered legions across Gaul and marched toward Vercingetorix's territory. But the Gaul leader was not willing to face him in open field. Not yet. Instead, Vercingetorix implemented a strategy that would leave the Romans without resources. Scorched earth policy. He ordered his people to burn their villages, destroy their granaries, poison their wells. Anything that could be useful to the Roman legions had to be destroyed. The Gauls would pay a terrible price, but that price would be worth it if they could expel the invaders. Caesar and his legions found themselves marching through desolate territories without food, without shelter, Without supplies, the Roman soldiers began to suffer hunger. Morale began to crack. For the first time in years, Caesar was on the defensive, but Vercingetorix made a mistake that would cost him dearly. During one of the Gaul war councils, a discussion arose. The Bituriges tribe refused to burn their main city, Avaricum. It was a rich city with large grain stores. The Bituriges chiefs argued they could defend it. Vercingetorix was not convinced, but he yielded to pressure. It was a fatal mistake. Caesar saw the opportunity, besieged Avaricum with brutal speed. His military engineers built siege ramps, towers, and battering rams in record time. The Gaul defenses, though courageous, could not resist the Roman war machine. After weeks of siege, the legions breached the walls. What followed was a massacre. Caesar, furious at the difficulties he had endured in the campaign, showed no mercy. Of the 40,000 inhabitants of Avaricum, only 800 survived. The rest were put to the sword. The streets of the city filled with blood. The grain stores the Gauls had tried to protect now fed the Roman legions. Vercingetorix had lost a city, thousands of warriors, and worst of all, he had lost credibility in front of his people. But he did not give up. He withdrew to the fortress of Gergovia in Arverni territory. There on top of a steep hill, he gathered his forces and waited for Caesar. Gergovia was different. This time Vercingetorix had the advantage of the terrain. Caesar attempted to take the fortress with a direct assault, but the steep slopes and Gaul defenses proved too strong. The Roman legionaries, normally disciplined and relentless, were repelled with heavy losses. It was Caesar's first great defeat in Gaul. 700 legionaries died on the slopes of Gergovia, and worse, the news of the Roman defeat spread like wildfire throughout Gaul. Tribes that had remained neutral now joined Vercingetorix. The Aedui, who had been Rome's allies for years, rebelled and joined the Gaul cause. Vercingetorix's army grew. His reputation grew, and suddenly it seemed Rome might lose Gaul forever. Caesar was in a dangerous position. He had to act quickly or risk seeing his entire conquest collapse. So he made a risky decision. Instead of retreating, he pursued Vercingetorix. The Gaul leader, for his part, decided to consolidate his forces. He needed a safe place to regroup, resupply, and coordinate the final effort to expel the Romans from Gaul. He chose Alesia. Alesia was perfect. Located on top of Mont Ossois with rivers protecting both flanks and steep slopes, making any assault difficult. The fortress was practically impregnable. Vercingetorix brought 80,000 warriors there. He had sufficient supplies to hold out for weeks, perhaps months. And most importantly, he had sent messengers to all the Gaul tribes asking for reinforcements. The response was overwhelming. More than 250,000 warriors from all Gaul tribes gathered and marched toward Alesia. The plan was simple. Vercingetorix would hold out inside the fortress while the relief army crushed Caesar from outside. It was a solid logical strategy, and it should have worked, but Vercingetorix underestimated his enemy. When Caesar arrived at Alesia and saw the fortress, he did not see an insurmountable obstacle. He saw an opportunity. If he could trap Vercingetorix inside Alesia, he could destroy the heart of Gaul resistance in one blow. So Caesar did something no general had done before. He ordered the construction of a double ring of fortifications, one to keep Vercingetorix inside, one to keep the relief army out, and so began the most audacious, most brutal, and most decisive siege in ancient history. When Caesar ordered the construction of the fortifications around Alesia, his own officers must have thought their commander had lost his mind. What he was proposing was not just ambitious, it was practically suicidal. Think about it for a moment. 60,000 Roman legionaries were about to build 39 kilometers of fortifications. We are not talking about simple wooden palisades. We are talking about complex defensive systems with multiple layers of protection, thousands of deadly traps, watchtowers, and deep ditches. And all this had to be completed before the Gaul relief army arrived. Time was the enemy. Every day that passed, the 250,000 Gaul warriors came closer. If they arrived before the fortifications were complete, the Roman legions would be massacred between two enemy forces with no protection. But Caesar trusted in something that had turned Rome into the dominant military power of the ancient world: Roman military engineering. Every Roman legionary was not just a soldier, He was also an engineer, a builder, and tireless worker. The legionaries were trained to build fortified camps every night during marches. They knew how to dig trenches, erect palisades, build towers, and now they were about to put all those skills into practice in the most ambitious construction any of them had ever seen. The first line of fortification was the contravallation, the inner wall facing Alesia. This ring was 18 kilometers long and completely surrounded the Gaul fortress. The goal was simple: to ensure that Vercingetorix and his 80,000 warriors could not get out. But this was not a simple palisade. It was a multi-layered defensive system designed to kill in the most efficient ways possible. First, the legionaries dug a ditch 6 meters deep and 6 meters wide. This ditch was flooded by diverting water from nearby rivers. Any Gaul who tried to cross it would have to swim loaded with armor and weapons, becoming an easy target for Roman archers and javelin throwers. Behind the flooded ditch, they dug 2 more ditches, each almost 5 meters wide and more than 1.5 meters deep. These ditches were not flooded, but filled with sharpened stakes pointing upward, designed to impale anyone who fell in. Behind the ditches, they erected a compacted earth rampart 4 meters high. On top of the rampart, they built a wooden palisade with watchtowers every 30 meters. The towers allowed the Romans to have a complete view of the entire perimeter and respond quickly to any attack. But Caesar did not stop there. He ordered the installation of additional traps that would turn any assault attempt into a bloody nightmare. The Scipi were thick logs with sharpened points buried in the ground at an angle like giant teeth pointed at the enemy. Impossible to see in the dark, they impaled Gaul warriors attempting to charge the Roman lines. The lilia or lilies were shallow pits, each with a pointed stake at the bottom, covered with branches and earth to camouflage them. A warrior who stepped on one of these traps would fall onto the stake, piercing his foot or leg. Thousands of these traps were installed in open ground in front of the fortifications. The stimuli were iron hooks with sharpened points half buried in the ground, designed to destroy the attacker's feet. They were practically invisible until it was too late. The contravallation was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, but it was only half the project because, while one group of legionaries built the inner wall, another group was building something even more impressive: the circumvallation, the outer wall. This ring was 21 kilometers long and faced outward toward the direction from which the Gaul relief army would come. Its purpose was to keep out the 250,000 warriors marching to save Vercingetorix. The circumvallation was essentially identical in design to the contravallation. Flooded ditches, ditches with stakes, ramparts, palisades, watchtowers. But there was a crucial difference. This time, the Romans were building defenses against a much more numerous enemy. If the contravallation was impressive, the circumvallation was monumental. The numbers are staggering. The Roman legionaries dug more than 90 kilometers of ditches. They cut and transported tens of thousands of trees to build the palisades and towers. They installed literally hundreds of thousands of individual traps, moved millions of tons of earth to build the ramparts. All this in less than 6 weeks. Imagine the physical effort. Every legionary worked from dawn to dusk digging, cutting, building without rest, because everyone knew that if the fortifications were not complete when the Gaul army arrived, they would die, and they could not work in peace. From Alesia, Vercingetorix could see what the Romans were doing, and he would not stand idly by while they trapped him. He launched several attacks against the Roman lines during construction. His cavalry charged the legionaries working on the fortifications, trying to disrupt the work, kill the workers, destroy what had already been built. But Caesar had anticipated this. He divided his forces into 2 groups. One group worked on the fortifications. The other remained armed and ready to repel any Gaul attack. Every time Vercingetorix's cavalry attacked, the Roman cohorts quickly formed the testudo, the turtle formation with interlocked shields, and repelled the attack. The Gauls suffered considerable losses in these attacks and soon realized something terrifying. They were being enclosed. The walls surrounding them grew every day. The traps multiplied, and with each passing day, their options dwindled. Inside Alesia, the situation began to deteriorate. 80,000 warriors consumed food rapidly. The supplies Vercingetorix had accumulated began to run out. Rations were reduced. Hunger began to loom. Vercingetorix made a desperate decision. He ordered that all useless mouths, the elderly, women and children, be expelled from the fortress. He hoped the Romans would let them pass, thus relieving pressure on his supplies. But Caesar was implacable. He ordered that no one be allowed to cross the Roman lines. The Gaul refugees remained trapped between the walls of Alesia and the Roman fortifications without food, without shelter. Many died of hunger in no man's land under the eyes of their own warriors, who could do nothing to help them. It was calculated cruelty. Caesar knew this would undermine Gaul morale, and it worked. Finally, after weeks of exhausting work, the fortifications were complete. 39 kilometers of walls, ditches, and traps. A double ring that enclosed 80,000 Gauls inside and would soon have to contain 250,000 more outside. The Roman legionaries, exhausted but prepared, took their positions, and then the moment everyone had feared arrived. On the horizon appeared the dust of 250,000 Gaul warriors marching toward Alesia. The relief army had arrived. The trap was complete. 330,000 Gauls, 60,000 Romans, and 39 kilometers of fortifications that would decide the fate of Gaul. The final battle was about to begin. The moment Caesar had feared and anticipated finally arrived. On the southern horizon of Alesia, a cloud of dust rises like an apocalyptic storm. It was not a natural storm. It was the Gaul relief army. 250,000 warriors marched in formation toward the Roman lines. The ground trembled under their feet as if the earth itself was protesting the magnitude of the violence about to unfold. Gaul war chants echoed through the valleys. A terrifying chorus of male voices promising death and destruction to the Roman invaders. It was such a massive force that it took hours for the entire army to deploy in front of the Roman fortifications. From the watchtowers, the legionaries watched with fascination and terror as the plain filled with warriors. Colored shields, spears pointed at the sky, tribal banners waving in the wind. It was as if all of Gaul had come to Alesia. The legionaries in the circumvallation watched the spectacle with a mixture of fear and determination. They had built those walls with their own hands. They had dug every ditch, planted every stake, erected every tower, every drop of sweat, every aching muscle. Every blister on their hands had been for this moment. Now they would have to trust that their work would keep them alive. From atop Alesia, Vercingetorix and his 80,000 warriors watched the arrival of the reinforcements. For the first time in weeks, there was hope in their eyes. Hunger had weakened them terribly. Rations had been reduced to almost nothing. Some men were so weak they could barely hold their weapons. They had been forced to expel the women, children, and elderly from the city, condemning them to starve between the lines. They had seen their own people perish in no man's land while they could do nothing. But now their Gaul brothers had arrived to free them. 250,000 warriors. The largest force Gaul had ever assembled. Caesar was at the center of this deadly ring. 60,000 Romans, 330,000 enemies surrounded on all sides. There was no escape, no possible retreat, no reinforcements that could arrive in time. It was victory or total annihilation. This was the greatest wager of Caesar's life. If he won here, Gaul would be his forever. If he lost, his military career would end in the most humiliating massacre in Roman history. His legions would be destroyed. He himself would likely be captured, tortured, and executed by the Gauls. Everything depended on the next hours. The commander of the Gaul relief army was Commius, king of the Atrebates and veteran of many battles against Rome. He was not an impulsive man nor a warrior blinded by emotion. He was an experienced strategist. He spent the first day studying the Roman fortifications, riding around the perimeter, looking for weak points, planning his strategy. What he saw must have worried him deeply. The Roman defenses were far more formidable than he had imagined. Flooded ditches 6 meters wide, deep pits full of sharpened stakes, ramparts meters high, reinforced palisades, watchtowers every 30 meters, and between the lines, entire fields covered with deadly traps that would turn any charge into a bloody nightmare. But Commius had the numbers on his side, overwhelming numbers. 250,000 against 60,000, a ratio of more than 4 to 1. And if he coordinated his attack with Vercingetorix, the Romans would have to fight on 2 fronts, simultaneously dividing their already outnumbered forces. So he designed a simple but brutal plan, coordinated attacks from inside and outside, crushing the Romans between 2 massive forces like a hammer and anvil. The night before the first attack, the Gaul camp was filled with almost euphoric confidence. The warriors sharpened their swords, checked their shields, repaired their armor. The bonfires illuminated thousands of determined faces. The bards sang songs of anticipated victory. The tribal chiefs gave inspiring speeches about the freedom of Gaul and the final expulsion of the Roman invaders. Tomorrow they would crush the Romans. Tomorrow they would free Vercingetorix. Tomorrow Gaul would be free forever. In the Roman lines, the atmosphere was completely different. The legionaries were silent. There were no songs, no grand speeches, only a tense, heavy silence full of anticipation. They knew what was coming. They knew the next hours would determine whether they would see another dawn. Many wrote farewell letters to their families in Italy, knowing they would probably never receive them. Some prayed to Mars, the god of war, asking for strength and courage. Others prayed to Jupiter, asking for protection. Others simply sharpened their gladii, checked their shields, adjusted their armor, and waited for dawn. Caesar walked the lines that night. He did not ride. He walked among his men, section by section, cohort by cohort. He spoke to centurions and common soldiers alike. He reminded them of the battles they had won together. He reminded them of the tribes they had subdued. He reminded them that they were Roman legionaries, the best soldiers the world had ever known. He reminded them that they had built those fortifications with their own hands, that every ditch, every stake, every trap was their work, that the defenses that would protect them the next day were the fruit of their sweat and labor. But above all, he reminded them of something simple and terrible. They had no other choice. There was no retreat, no surrender, no way to escape, only victory or death. And if they had to die, they would die as Romans. The first attack came at noon the next day. From Alesia, Vercingetorix launched his hungry and desperate warriors against the Contravallation. At the same time, from outside, Commius ordered the massive assault against the circumvallation. The war drums rolled in unison, the battle horns, the Gaul carnix with their boar-head mouths sounded with a blood-curdling scream, and more than 200,000 Gaul warriors charged simultaneously against the Roman lines from both sides. The roar was deafening, a collective cry from 200,000 throats that seemed to shake the sky itself. The Gauls shouted their war chants as they ran toward the Roman fortifications brandishing swords. Spears, axes, thousands of bare feet in leather sandals struck the ground in a continuous thunder that made the soil vibrate. From the Roman towers, the observers saw the human tide approaching. It was like watching an avalanche, a force of nature impossible to stop. And then they began to die. The first to fall were those who stepped on the Lilia, the camouflage traps, thousands of shallow pits covered with branches and earth, each with a pointed stake at the bottom, stakes that pierced feet, legs, ankles. The warriors fell, screaming in pain and surprise. Those behind, charging at full speed, tripped over the bodies of fallen comrades, creating a domino effect of chaos and confusion. Then they reached the stimuli, the half-buried iron hooks, bare feet and leather sandals destroyed by the sharp points. Proud warriors fell howling, clutching mutilated feet. Blood began to soak the ground, turning the earth into a red, slippery mire. Those who survived the traps reached the ditches. The first, flooded with water, diverted from nearby rivers, forced the Gauls to stop. Some tried to swim, loaded with wooden shields and iron armor. Many sank immediately, drowning in water that grew redder every minute. The Roman archers positioned on the towers and ramparts rained arrows on the Gauls trapped in the water. It was like target practice. Arrows fell in dense clouds, each finding exposed flesh. The water filled with floating corpses. The few who managed to cross the first ditch, exhausted and soaked, immediately faced the dry ditches full of pointed stakes. Many fell straight in, impaling themselves on multiple points. Their agonized screams echoed across the battlefield. Others tried to jump them and failed, crashing into the stakes with enough force to pierce leather armor, and those who, against all odds, managed to get past the ditches and trenches finally reached the 4-meter-high rampart. At the top, a reinforced palisade defended by Roman legionaries in perfect close formation. Interlocked shields, spears and pila pointed downward, a wall of steel and discipline. The Roman spears fell on the Gauls trying to climb the rampart. The heavy javelins, the pila, were launched in coordinated volleys, piercing shields and armor. The Gauls fell backward, dragging others with them. Some Gaul warriors, the bravest or most desperate, managed to reach the palisade, tried to climb it barehanded. The legionaries greeted them with short swords, the gladii designed specifically for close combat. Rapid, precise slashes, throats cut, bellies opened, faces destroyed. The first assault lasted 3 hours of uninterrupted carnage. It was brutal, bloody, and completely fruitless. The Gauls failed to break any section of the Roman fortifications. Not a single breach, not a single point of penetration. They left thousands dead in the trap fields, bodies piled up in the ditches, in the trenches, at the foot of the ramparts. The air filled with the smell of blood, sweat, and death. Gaul morale so high in the morning began to crack, but Commius was not a man who gave up easily. That night, as the Gauls withdrew their wounded and counted their dead, he planned something different, something more dangerous, a night attack. Darkness would be their ally. The traps would be practically invisible. The Romans would have enormous difficulty seeing the attackers until they were almost upon them. And the psychological terror of an assault in the dead of night, with screams coming out of the dark, could break even the legendary Roman discipline. At midnight, no moon in the deepest darkness, the Gaul army attacked again. This time they were better prepared. They brought fascines, large bundles of dry branches tied together that they threw into the ditches to create makeshift bridges. They brought wooden ladders to climb the palisades. They brought iron hooks to tear away defensive stakes. They brought large shields to form protective testudos against arrows. And they came in silence, without war chants, without screams. Only the sound of thousands of feet moving in the darkness was terrifying. The Roman sentries on the towers heard the movement before they saw it. A vast whisper in the night. Voices murmuring orders in Gaulish. The creaking of thousands of men moving through the grass. The alarm sounded. Roman horns blared. Torches lit along the walls, and then the Gauls emerged from the darkness like demons. They hurled themselves against the fortifications with desperate ferocity. The fascines fell into the ditches. The Gauls ran over them, charging toward the ramparts. Ladders slammed against the palisades. Warriors began to climb, and it almost worked. In various points of the circumvallation, especially in sectors where the torches were slowest to light, the Gauls managed to cross the ditches, scale the ramparts, and reach the palisades. Hand-to-hand combat exploded on the walls. Swords clashed against swords. In the dark shields, shattered men fell screaming from the towers, their bodies disappearing into the darkness. The legionaries fought desperately in near total darkness. In many sectors, it was practically impossible to distinguish friend from foe. Confusion was total chaos reigned. In some points, the Roman lines began to give way under the pressure. Caesar acted with the speed and decision that had made him famous. He rode along the inner lines, bringing reserve cohorts to the points of greatest pressure. He himself appeared in the most threatened sectors. His presence recognizable even in the dark, shouting orders, reorganizing the defense, inspiring his men with his mere presence. And slowly, desperately, centimeter by bloody centimeter, the Romans pushed the Gauls back. The palisades were recovered, the invaders thrown down from the walls. The bodies of Gaul warriors fell from above, crashing onto the stakes below. When dawn broke, the night assault had been repelled, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The Romans had suffered significant losses. Experienced centurions had fallen, entire cohorts decimated. Exhaustion took hold of the legions like a disease. They had fought for hours without rest, without sleep, with little food and water. And Commius had one last ace up his sleeve. His scouts, studying the fortifications for days, had identified the weakest point of the entire Roman defensive system, the northern sector near Montreuil. There, the terrain was uneven and rugged, making robust defenses enormously difficult to build like in the other sectors. The ditches were less deep because the rocky soil prevented digging deeper. The ramparts were lower because there was not enough earth. The palisades were more spaced. It was the vulnerable point, the Achilles heel of the whole system. Commius gathered his best warriors, 60,000 men, the strongest, the most experienced, the most determined, and prepared them for a massive assault concentrated exclusively on that single point. If they could break the defenses there, they could envelop the Romans and destroy them completely. Caesar's entire plan would collapse. The legions would be massacred between two Gaul forces. At dawn on the third day, the final attack began. 60,000 Gaul warriors, the elite of the relief army, charged against the northern sector on Montreuil. It was not a disorganized charge. It was a coordinated, disciplined assault, concentrated in a single point with all possible force. At the same time, to prevent Caesar from shifting reinforcements, Vercingetorix launched all his available men, weakened by hunger but desperate for freedom, against the contravallation on the completely opposite side. The Romans were crushed from both sides. The pressure was unbearable. On Montreuil, the situation became critical in minutes. The 60,000 Gauls concentrated in such a small sector broke the first defensive lines almost immediately. The traps were not enough. The shallow ditches were crossed, the low palisades scaled. The Gauls climbed the ramparts like an unstoppable tide. They began to slaughter the outnumbered Roman defenders. Panic, that mortal enemy of any army, began to spread among the Roman cohorts. Some legionaries began to retreat. The line began to break. If that sector fell, all was lost. The Gauls would flood inside the fortifications. The legions would be surrounded and annihilated. Caesar, watching the battle from his command position, saw the disaster unfolding and made the most audacious, most risky, most desperate decision of the entire campaign. He gathered his last reserve, his Germanic cavalry, 1,000 elite horsemen he had recruited from allied tribes across the Rhine. Massive men on huge horses, armed with long lances and heavy swords. He mounted his war horse, removed his general's red cloak, and waved it in the air so that all Romans and Gauls could see it, and he personally led the charge. He rode around the inside of the fortifications at full speed, galloping along paths his engineers had left for this purpose. He arrived behind the Gaul attack on Montreuil and charged them from the rear. It was a moment of absolute tactical genius and personal courage. Caesar, the proconsul of Rome, the conqueror of Gaul, risked his own life in a desperate cavalry charge. The Gauls, completely focused on breaking the Roman defenses in front, did not expect anything from behind at all. They thought all Roman strength was in front of them on the walls. The cavalry charge was devastating. The Germanic horsemen, huge on their war horses, cut through the rear Gaul ranks like a scythe through wheat. Lances pierced back, swords fell on unsuspecting heads. Horse hooves crushed skulls and ribs. Absolute chaos seized the Gaul attackers. Where had this cavalry come from? How had they arrived from behind? And at that precise moment, the Roman cohorts defending Montreuil, seeing their general lead the charge, regained their courage, counterattacked with renewed ferocity, pushed from the front, while the cavalry crushed from behind. The 60,000 Gaul warriors were trapped between two Roman forces, the hammer and the anvil. The perfect trap. Panic turned to terror. Terror turned to defeat. Defeat turned to rout. Rout turned to massacre. The Gauls broke ranks and fled in total disorder. Discipline evaporated. Each man thought only of himself. The Romans pursued them without mercy. Thousands were cut down from behind as they fled desperately. The fields filled with corpses. From his high position on Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the destruction of the relief army. He saw his Gaul brothers break and flee like terrified sheep. He saw his hopes, his dreams of freedom collapse in blood and death. The relief army, what remained of it, withdrew. 250,000 men had arrived at Alesia full of confidence and hope. Less than half returned home. More than 100,000 Gaul corpses lay in the fields around the Roman fortifications. Inside Alesia, there was no longer hope, no more food, no more drinking water, no reinforcements, no way out, no future. Vercingetorix gathered his tribal chiefs. The decision was unanimous, heartbreaking. To save the surviving warriors, to prevent them from being massacred, to the last man, Vercingetorix would surrender. The next day, the gates of Alesia slowly opened. A single rider emerged riding a magnificent warhorse. It was Vercingetorix, dressed in his best ceremonial armor, polished to shine like the sun. He carried his best shield decorated with the symbols of his tribe. His long sword hung from his belt. He rode slowly with dignity towards Caesar's camp. 80,000 Gaul warriors watched from the walls. 60,000 Roman legionaries watched from the fortifications. The silence was absolute. When Vercingetorix arrived before Caesar, who was seated on a raised platform surrounded by his officers, he dismounted with deliberate movements. Without saying a word, placed his sword, his shield, and his helmet at the feet of the Roman conqueror. Then slowly he knelt. The greatest leader Gaul had ever known surrendered to Rome. Gaul resistance was over. Gaul had fallen, and the legend of Julius Caesar as Rome's greatest general was sealed forever. The image of Vercingetorix kneeling before Caesar would become one of the most iconic moments in ancient history. But behind that moment of ceremonial surrender, there was a far more brutal and complex reality that deserves in-depth analysis. What had really just happened at Alesia? How had 60,000 Romans defeated 330,000 Gauls? Was it simply luck? Was it Caesar's genius? Or was there something deeper at play? To understand the greatness of this victory, we must dissect the Roman strategy with surgical precision. The first thing we must recognize is that Caesar's double fortification was not simply innovative, it was revolutionary. Never before in military history had anything like it been attempted. The idea itself defied all conventional logic. Think about it. When an army besieges a fortress, it builds fortifications facing the fortress. That is the basic manual of sieges. But Caesar did something no general had conceived before. He built fortifications facing both directions simultaneously. He created what modern military historians call a circumvallation siege, but elevated to a scale that would not be attempted again for centuries. Caesar's fortifications at Alesia totaled 39 kilometers of walls, ditches, and traps. To put this in perspective, it is approximately the distance of a full Olympic marathon. And all this, was built in less than 6 weeks by men who simultaneously had to defend against Gaul attacks, find food and water, and maintain combat readiness. Caesar's genius lay not only in the ambition of the project, but in the engineering details that made it functional. The flooded ditches were not simply obstacles, they were psychological traps. Many Gaul warriors who could not swim faced the terror of drowning before even reaching the enemy. The water also made the use of ladders and siege towers enormously difficult, and the corpses accumulating in the water created a devastating psychological effect on the attackers coming behind. The stake-filled ditches were mathematically calculated. The depth, the angle of the stakes, the distance between them, everything was designed to maximize enemy losses. A warrior who fell into one of these ditches not only impaled himself, but remained stuck in such a way that it was almost impossible to save him without exposing himself to enemy fire. The lilia or lilies were perhaps the most diabolical traps camouflaged to look like safe ground. They turned every step into a deadly gamble. Once losses began due to these traps, the attackers entered panic, not knowing where it was safe to put their feet. The coordinated charge turned into chaos of men trying to avoid traps instead of attacking the enemy. The stimuli completed the system. Even if a warrior avoided the lilies, the iron hooks destroyed his feet, leaving him unable to continue fighting. It was a multi-layered defense system where each layer exponentially increased the effectiveness of the next. Attackers who survived the traps arrived exhausted at the ditches. Those who survived the ditches arrived wounded and disorganized at the ramparts. Those who survived the ramparts arrived completely exhausted at the palisades where rested legionaries awaited them in perfect formation. But engineering was only part of the equation. The real decisive factor was Roman discipline. The Roman legionaries were without doubt the best trained soldiers of the ancient world. But even for them, Alesia was an extreme test. They were outnumbered more than 5 to 1. They were exhausted from weeks of brutal construction work. They were rationing food and water. They knew there were no possible reinforcements. They knew that if the lines broke, they would all die, and despite all this, they maintained formation. They obeyed orders, fought with the mechanical precision that was their hallmark. This discipline came from years of constant training. An average Roman legionary trained practically every day. They marched with full equipment, weighing more than 30 kilograms. They practiced formations until they could perform them in their sleep. They learned to obey orders instantly without question. At Alesia, this discipline was the difference between victory and total annihilation. When the Gaul night attack nearly broke the lines in various sectors, it was not Roman numerical superiority that saved the day. It was the cohort's ability to reorganize under pressure, maintain cohesion even in the chaos of night, battle obey counterattack orders when every instinct screamed to flee. Compare this with the Gauls. The Gaul warriors were brave, no doubt. They charged repeatedly against fortifications that were clearly deadly. They charged into ditches full of their comrades' corpses. They scaled palisades knowing they would probably die, but they lacked Roman organization. When Commius ordered an attack, his warriors charged with ferocity, but each tribe fought slightly differently. There was no coordinated communication between different sections of the army. When facing a setback, they could not quickly reorganize. And crucially, when panic set in on Montreuil, The rout was total and irreversible. There were no centurions shouting orders, no command structures maintaining cohesion. It was a human stampede where each man sought his own survival. Now let's talk about the human cost of this battle because the numbers are staggering and terrifying. Of the 80,000 Gaul warriors inside Alesia, about 40,000 survived to surrender. The rest died during the siege, either in attacks against the Roman fortifications or from hunger and disease. Of the relief army of 250,000 men, historical estimates suggest more than 100,000 died in the 3 days of battle, as many wounded. Only about 120,000 managed to escape relatively intact. In total, more than 140,000 Gauls died at Alesia. 140,000. Let that number sink in. It is more than the population of many modern cities. The fields around Alesia remain literally covered with corpses. The rivers ran red with blood. The smell of death was so intense that the Romans had to burn massive piles of bodies to prevent disease. Roman losses, though significantly fewer, were not insignificant. Caesar never recorded exact numbers in his writings, probably because admitting large losses would weaken his political position in Rome. But modern historians estimate he lost between 10 and 12,000 legionaries, about 1/5 of his total force. They were professional soldiers trained for years, hard to replace. But Caesar considered it an acceptable price for the decisive victory he had achieved because the political consequences of Alesia were immense. For Gaul, Alesia marked the end of any realistic hope of independence. Vercingetorix had been the last great leader capable of uniting the tribes. With his capture, organized resistance collapsed. The remaining resisting tribes began to surrender one by one. In less than a year, all of Gaul was pacified. Gaul would become a Roman province. Its people would be Romanized. Its Gaulish language would gradually be replaced by vulgar Latin that would evolve into modern French. Its gods would be syncretized with Roman gods. Its cities would be rebuilt in the Roman model. The Gaul culture that had flourished for centuries effectively died at Alesia. For Caesar, the consequences were equally dramatic, but in the opposite direction. Alesia consolidated him as Rome's greatest general. His already impressive military reputation reached legendary heights. He had achieved the impossible, captured the leader of Gaul. Resistance definitively subdued the most troublesome region for Rome, and most importantly for his political ambitions, earned unbreakable loyalty from his legions. The soldiers who survived Alesia knew they owed their lives to their commander's strategic genius. That loyalty would be crucial in the years to come when Caesar would need it to cross the Rubicon and march on Rome itself. The riches of Gaul, the spoils of years of conquest, filled Caesar's coffers. With that money, he bought influence in Rome, corrupted senators, funded public works that made him popular with the Roman people. Alesia did not just give Gaul to Caesar. It gave him the resources and reputation that would ultimately allow him to become dictator of Rome. From a purely military perspective, Alesia established principles that would be studied for 2 millennia. The importance of field fortifications, the effectiveness of multi-layered defenses, the value of military engineering, the supremacy of discipline over numbers, the importance of strategic reserves, the psychological impact of personal leadership. Generals from Napoleon to Eisenhower studied Alesia. The battle appears in virtually all classical military strategy texts. It is a case study in modern military academies because Alesia demonstrated something fundamental about war, that victory does not always go to the strongest or most numerous, but to the best prepared, the best organized, the most disciplined. Could Vercingetorix have won it is a question historians have debated for 2,000 years. If he had waited longer before taking refuge in Alesia, if the relief army had arrived sooner, if he had better coordinated attacks from inside and outside, if he had attacked during the construction of the fortifications instead of waiting for them to be complete, there are 1,000 historical ifs. But in the end, he faced an enemy superior in organization, discipline, and military engineering, and those advantages proved decisive. The sad irony is that Gaul courage, their willingness to die for the freedom of their land, was not enough against the Roman military machine. Individual courage could not overcome collective organization, and so on. The blood-soaked fields of Alesia. Not only an army died, the independence of Gaul, died a culture, died a dream of freedom, died, but something else was born. The legend of Julius Caesar was born, and a lesson that would echo through the centuries was born, that in war preparation, discipline and strategy can defeat overwhelming numbers. Alesia was not just a battle, it was the moment when Rome proved truly invincible. Vercingetorix's story did not end at Alesia. In fact, what came after was in many ways even more cruel than the battle itself. After his surrender, Vercingetorix was chained and sent to Rome but not executed immediately. Caesar had other plans for him. The Gaul leader would be the centerpiece of the grandest triumph Rome had ever seen. For 6 years, Vercingetorix remained a prisoner. 6 years in a dark cell, probably, in the Tullianum, Rome's underground prison, notorious for its inhumane conditions. 6 years waiting for the moment he would be paraded as a war trophy before the Roman people. That moment came in the year 46 before Christ, when Caesar finally celebrated his triumph over Gaul. Vercingetorix, who had once been the proud leader of a nation, was dragged in chains through the streets of Rome. The crowd booed him, threw garbage, insulted him. He was part of the spectacle, the public humiliation of the defeated enemy. After the triumphal parade, as was Roman custom with captured enemy leaders, Vercingetorix was strangled in a cell. His body was thrown away without ceremony. Thus ended the man who had come closest to expelling Rome from Gaul. But even though the man died, his legacy survived in ways neither Caesar nor Vercingetorix could have imagined. In the centuries following the Roman conquest, Gaul was completely transformed. Gaul's cities were rebuilt, following the Roman model with forums, aqueducts, amphitheaters, and baths. The Gaulish language gradually disappeared, replaced by Latin. Gaul gods were syncretized with Roman gods. Gaul tribes became Roman civitates. By the 2nd century after Christ, Gaul was one of the most prosperous and Romanized provinces of the empire. It was hard to believe that just 150 years earlier, this had been a land of warrior tribes fiercely resisting Roman domination. The Gaul culture as it existed in Vercingetorix's time had effectively been erased. But here is the fascinating thing. Although Gaul had been Romanized, it never completely forgot its pre-Roman identity. Elements of Gaul culture survived beneath the surface, blending with Roman culture to create something new. And when the Roman Empire finally collapsed in the 5th century, when the Germanic Franks conquered the old Roman Gaul, the territory that would eventually become France inherited both the Roman legacy and distant echoes of its Gaul past. During the Middle Ages, Vercingetorix was practically forgotten. Medieval chroniclers had little interest in the pre-Christian past of their lands. Caesar's stories were read but mainly as Latin texts for students, not as national history. It was only in the 19th century that Vercingetorix experienced an extraordinary revival. In 1865, during the Second French Empire under Napoleon III, a massive statue of Vercingetorix was erected at the site of Alesia. The statue showed him as a noble, brave, and patriotic hero. Ironically, it was commissioned by a French emperor who admired Julius Caesar and saw himself as his successor. Vercingetorix became a symbol of French nationalism. He was presented as the first French national hero, the man who dared challenge a foreign invading empire. During the Nazi occupation of France in World War II, the French resistance invoked the spirit of Vercingetorix as inspiration to resist another foreign conqueror. It is a profound historical irony. The man who lost his war, whose people were conquered and assimilated, became an eternal symbol of national resistance and freedom. Now let's talk about Alesia's military legacy, because its influence on military strategy is profound and lasting. Caesar's double line of fortifications set a precedent that would be studied and occasionally imitated for centuries. During the Crusades, European crusaders attempted similar strategies when besieging Muslim cities. During the English Civil War, both sides built complex siege lines. During World War I, the concept of fortified lines in multiple directions found its ultimate expression in the trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland. But what makes Alesia unique is the scale and context. Never before and rarely after had a commander risked so much betting everything on such an audacious strategy. The tactical principles demonstrated at Alesia remain relevant. The importance of engineering works in war. Caesar understood that digging ditches and building walls was not degrading work for soldiers, it was an essential part of the military art. This lesson was forgotten and relearned many times throughout history, the value of preparation over improvisation. Caesar spent weeks building his defenses before the real battle. When the critical moment came, his preparations made the difference between victory and defeat, the discipline as a force multiplier. The 60,000 Romans overcame the 330,000 Gauls, not because they were stronger or braver, but because they were more disciplined and organized. Personal leadership in critical moments. When the situation on Montreuil became desperate, Caesar did not send orders from afar. He mounted his horse and personally led the cavalry charge that saved the day. That kind of leadership inspired a loyalty that no amount of money could buy. The importance of strategic reserves. Caesar deliberately kept reserve troops instead of committing all his forces from the start. Those reserves allowed him to respond to unexpected crises. All these are principles military officers study to this day. But beyond the tactical lessons, Alesia teaches us something deeper about the nature of power and empire. Caesar did not win at Alesia simply because he was a better general than Vercingetorix, although he certainly was. He won because he represented a fundamentally superior political and military system. Rome was not just an army, it was an integrated administrative, economic, and military machine that could absorb defeats, rebuild legions, and keep pressing until its enemies were exhausted. Vercingetorix, no matter how brilliant, represented a fragile coalition of traditionally rival tribes. Once that coalition was defeated at Alesia, there was no institutional structure to continue the resistance. Vercingetorix's defeat was the defeat of Gaul resistance. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of war and conquest. Did the Gauls have the right to resist the Roman invasion? Absolutely. They were brave and justified in their struggle for freedom, without doubt. But their defeat was in some way inevitable, given the disparity in organization and resources between Rome and the Gaul tribes. Possibly, as they say, history is written by the victors, and for 2,000 years the story of Alesia was told mainly from the Roman perspective, based on Caesar's own writings and his commentaries on the Gaul War Commentariate de Bello Gallico. Only in modern times have we begun to appreciate the Gaul perspective, to understand that from their point of view, the Romans were not bearers of civilization but brutal invaders who massacred millions and enslaved millions more. Vercingetorix was not a rebel or a barbarian. He was a patriot fighting for his people's freedom against an expansionist empire. Both narratives are true, and this is perhaps Alesia's most important lesson, that history is rarely simple, that the heroes of one culture are the villains of another, and that the great battles that change the world are full of tragedy for both sides. When we visit the site of Alesia today, we find peaceful fields, green hills, and an impressive statue of Vercingetorix looking toward the horizon. It is hard to imagine that this peaceful place was once the scene of one of the bloodiest battles in ancient history. But if we listen carefully, if we use our historical imagination, we can still hear the echoes of those terrible days. The clash of weapons, the screams of the wounded, the Gaul war chants, the orders shouted in Latin, the thunder of thousands of feet running toward death. Alesia reminds us that our modern civilization, with all its comforts and relative peace, is built on a mountain of human sacrifice, that Europe's borders were drawn in blood, that the languages we speak, the laws under which we live, the cultures we inherit were all shaped by battles like this. And it reminds us of something else, that human courage, both in victory and defeat, deserves to be remembered and honored. 60,000 Romans who refused to flee when surrounded by overwhelming forces. 330,000 Gauls who charged repeatedly against deadly fortifications in the name of freedom. A Roman commander who bet his career and his life on an audacious strategy. A Gaul leader who sacrificed his freedom and eventually his life trying to save his people. All of them, Romans and Gauls, victors and vanquished, were real human beings. They had families, hopes, dreams, fears, and all of them converged in a small corner of Gaul in the year 52 before Christ to be protagonists of one of the decisive moments in world history. This is the true lesson of Alesia, not just tactics or strategy, but humanity. The human capacity for extraordinary courage, selfless sacrifice, and unyielding determination both in victory and defeat. And this, more than any wall or trap or military formation, is what makes this story worth telling 2,000 years later. If this story of impossible strategy, extreme courage, and battles that change the world forever has fascinated you, I invite you to explore other channel content. We have documentaries on Hannibal crossing the Alps, Alexander the Great, conquering the known world, and many other epic military history stories. Let me know in the comments what you think was Caesar's most brilliant decision at Alesia. The double fortification, the personal cavalry charge on Montreuil, or simply the audacity to stay instead of retreating. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you don't miss any content. See you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the battles and leaders who forged our world. See you soon, history lovers.